Eleanor Whitfield's hands were buried to the wrist in cold garden soil when she heard it. Wheels, 4 horses moving too fast for any honest visitor. She did not lift her head. She had trained herself not to hope. 3 days earlier, her own uncle had signed the papers that sent her away like a debt he was settling. 3 days earlier, she had been told to forget the name Ethan Caldwell, but hope, it turned out, did not ask permission. The carriage stopped at her gate, and her whole ruined world tilted sideways. Before we go on, if stories like this keep you company on quiet evenings, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far this story travels. The dirt under Eleanor's fingernails was the only thing that felt honest to her anymore. She pressed her palm flat against the cool earth of her aunt's kitchen garden, feeling the give of it, the small stubborn roots of something that hadn't given up growing even after a hard frost. Everything else in her life had been decided by other people. The soil didn't care what her uncle had written in his letters. The soil didn't care what the parlor in Richmond had whispered about her name. It only asked her to show up and dig, and she could do that. She could still do that much. She heard the sound before she understood it. A rattle first, then a rhythm underneath the rattle hooves, 4 of them striking a gravel road at a pace no farmer used to bring in milk or mail. She told herself it was nothing. A physician called out to Colonel Rutledge's place 2 farms over. A messenger with news for someone who wasn't her, because nobody sent news to Eleanor Whitfield anymore. Nobody had, not since the morning she'd been walked out of her uncle's house in Richmond with a single trunk and a letter of arrangement that read like a sentence handed down by a judge who'd never once looked her in the eye. The carriage did not pass the gate. It stopped there. Eleanor's hands went still in the dirt. "Eleanor?" Her aunt's voice came from the porch, sharp and low, the voice Margaret Tolbert used when she wanted to be heard without carrying to the road. "Eleanor, come inside." "Who is it?" "Come inside, child." But Eleanor was already standing, already wiping her hands against her apron in quick, useless strokes, already watching the carriage door swing open before the horses had fully stopped stamping. She knew the black lacquer of that door. She knew the particular arrogance of a driver who didn't bother slowing before he reined in. She had spent 11 months trying to forget every detail of that carriage, and here it was remembering her first. Ethan Caldwell stepped down into the road like a man who already owned it. He did not look at the house. He looked at her. Straight down the length of the garden, past her aunt's rose hedge, past the low fence Eleanor had mended herself with borrowed nails, and he looked at her the way he used to look at her before everything broke, like she was the only fixed point in a room full of moving furniture. "Mr. Caldwell?" Aunt Margaret was down the porch steps now, moving faster than a woman her age should move, putting her body between the road and her niece out of pure old instinct. "This is a private residence." "I'm aware, ma'am." Ethan's voice hadn't changed. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed, not his coat, not the dust on his boots. From what must have been 2 days of hard riding, but the voice calm as still water over rock. "I've come to speak with your niece. She has nothing to say to you." "Then I'll do the talking." He reached back into the carriage and drew out a leather case worn soft at the corners, the kind of case a man carried papers in, not gifts, not flowers. Eleanor felt something in her chest twist at the sight of it. Not disappointment exactly, something colder. Recognition. "This isn't a social call, Mrs. Tolbert. I wouldn't have ridden 2 days for a social call." Eleanor found her voice before her aunt could answer for her again. "What's in the case, Mr. Caldwell?" "The truth." He said it plainly, the way another man might say the weather. "The truth your uncle didn't want you to have." Margaret's hand found Eleanor's wrist gripping hard enough to bruise. "Don't. Aunt Margaret." Eleanor kept her eyes on Ethan. "I've spent 3 days in this garden trying to understand why my own uncle would send me away like I was something shameful to be hidden. If this man has an answer, I want to hear it." "He is the reason you were sent away." "No, ma'am." Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack in his composure. "With respect, I am not the reason. I am the man who found out the reason, and it isn't what you were told." The wind moved through the rose hedge. Nobody spoke for the length of 3 long breaths. You have 5 minutes, Margaret said finally. On the porch, where I can hear every word. Ethan Caldwell did not smile, but something in his shoulders eased, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long way. He walked up the garden path, and Eleanor made herself stay rooted where she stood, made herself wait for him to close the distance instead of closing it herself, because the last time she had run toward Ethan Caldwell, her whole life had come apart in her hands. "You look well," he said when he was close enough that only she and her aunt could hear it. "I look tired, Mr. Caldwell. There's a difference, and you know it." "Eleanor, you don't get to use my given name, not after 11 months of silence." Her voice shook on the last word, and she hated that it shook, hated that after everything she still couldn't keep her voice steady in front of him. "You don't get to ride up in a fine carriage with a leather case and act as though you didn't let me believe you'd simply decided I wasn't worth defending. I was in Charleston." His eyes didn't leave hers. "For 7 of those 11 months. Not by choice. Your uncle made certain of that." "My uncle has no business with your travels." "Your uncle," Ethan said, and now there was iron under the calm, "had every business with my travels, because I was 2 weeks from filing a claim against the guardianship of your estate when I was called away on a fabricated summons regarding my late father's land holdings in the Carolinas. A summons your uncle arranged. It took me this long to untangle it and get back." Margaret's grip on Eleanor's wrist loosened just slightly. "What estate? Ask her." Ethan tilted his head toward Eleanor, and something in his expression was almost gentle now, almost apologetic, as though he regretted being the one to hand her this particular truth. "Ask her what she knows of her mother's land in Fairfax County." Eleanor's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "My mother's land was sold, years ago, to settle debts." "It was never sold." The words landed like a struck bell. "It was transferred." Ethan went on, quiet and relentless, into a trust. A trust your uncle has controlled and drawn income from since you were 16 years old. A trust that comes to you in full the moment you either marry with the consent of your legal guardian or reach the age of 25, whichever comes first. "That's not possible." Eleanor heard her own voice come out thin. "I would have known. There would have been papers, notices, something." "There were papers." Ethan opened the leather case, drew out a folded document with a wax seal, long broken and reapplied, and held it out, not to her aunt, but to her directly the way he might hand a woman a knife and trust her to know what to do with it. "There were papers your uncle intercepted before you ever saw them. I have copies. Certified copies taken from the Fairfax County Land Office myself 3 weeks ago, at no small risk to my own neck." Eleanor did not take the paper. Not yet. She stared at it like it might bite her. "Why?" she said slowly. "Would my uncle hide an inheritance from me?" "Because he's spent it." Ethan's voice went flat, almost cold. "Or most of it. Gambling debts. Bad tobacco speculation 2 seasons running. He's been drawing against the trust as though it were his own money for 6 years, and the moment you marry or turn 25, an accounting comes due. A legal accounting, Eleanor. One that would show a shortfall he cannot cover. So he sent me away." Eleanor's hand finally rose, took the paper, though her fingers were unsteady. "Not to punish me. To buy time. To marry you off first." Margaret said suddenly, her voice gone very quiet, very dangerous. "Before you ever learned enough to ask questions. Before any husband of your choosing could look too closely at where your money's been going." "Yes, ma'am." Ethan didn't look away from Eleanor's face as he said it, watching the understanding move through her like weather crossing open ground. "There's a name attached to the arrangement he's been drafting. A Mr. Harlan Booth of Petersburg. A man your uncle owes a considerable sum to a debt that would be forgiven entirely upon a successful marriage." Eleanor felt the paper crumple slightly in her grip before she forced her fingers to loosen. "I've never met a Mr. Booth in my life." "You will," Ethan said grimly. "I have reason to believe he's already on the road. Your uncle sent word to Petersburg the same week he sent you here. I'd guess he means to have the matter settled quietly before anyone thinks to ask why a young woman with no fortune to speak of is suddenly worth a wedding trip. For a long moment, nobody on that porch said anything at all. Then Eleanor laughed one short disbelieving sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "He tried to sell me." "He is trying," Ethan corrected. "It isn't finished yet. And you rode 2 days with no word in 11 months to tell me that a stranger is coming to marry me for a debt I never knew I had." "I rode 2 days," Ethan said, and for the first time his voice cracked just slightly at the edges, "because I was not going to let you find out from a wedding announcement in a Petersburg newspaper. I owed you the truth in person, whatever else you think of me." Margaret Tolbert looked between them, her sharp eyes narrowing, and Eleanor recognized the particular stillness that came over her aunt when she was recalculating everything she thought she understood about a situation. "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said slowly, "why does a land dispute concern you so deeply? You are not family. You hold no claim on my niece's trust." "No, ma'am, I don't." Something moved behind Ethan's eyes. Old grief, old anger banked down, but not gone. "But I hold a claim on the truth of what happened to my own mother's estate 20 years ago in nearly the same manner. A guardian who spent what wasn't his. A marriage arranged to bury the debt. I watched it happen once already, and I couldn't sit in Charleston and let it happen to—" He stopped himself. "Let it happen to whom?" Eleanor said quietly. Ethan's eyes came back to hers, and there was nothing calculated in them now. Nothing of the careful, controlled man who'd stepped out of that carriage like he owned the road. "To someone I made a promise to. 11 months ago, before your uncle decided that promise was inconvenient to him." Eleanor's throat closed around whatever she meant to say next. Margaret cleared her throat, sharp and deliberate, breaking whatever had passed between them. 5 minutes was the agreement, Mr. Caldwell. Then let me use what's left of it." He reached into the case again, drew out a second document, and this one he did not hand to Eleanor. He held it against his chest, like something he wasn't ready to surrender yet. "This is a petition, drafted but not yet filed with Judge Strathmore Hale in Richmond, contesting the guardianship arrangement and demanding a formal accounting of the Whitfield Trust. I need your signature on it, Eleanor. Not your uncle's consent. Not your aunt's blessing. Yours. Because a woman of 21 has the legal right to petition a court in her own name regarding property held in trust for her benefit, provided she has the nerve to do it. And if I sign it, then your uncle's arrangement with Mr. Booth becomes worthless the moment the petition is filed, because no man marries a woman whose inheritance is under active legal dispute, not for a debt-clearing arrangement at least. It buys you time. Possibly it buys you everything. And if I don't sign it, Ethan's jaw worked once before he answered. Then I'll have done what I came to do, which was tell you the truth, and I'll go back to Richmond and file what I can without you, though it'll be a weaker case and take longer, and Mr. Booth may well reach Fairfax before the ink dries. That choice is entirely yours, Eleanor. I didn't ride here to make another decision for you. God knows enough men have already done that. Eleanor looked down at the document in her own hand. The certified copy of a trust she hadn't known existed an hour ago, and then at the petition held against Ethan Caldwell's chest like something precious. Aunt Margaret, she said slowly, may I have a private word with Mr. Caldwell? Absolutely not. Aunt Margaret, Eleanor Grace Whitfield, I have known this man for exactly 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes I have learned that your uncle is a thief, that you are the subject of an arranged sale disguised as a marriage, and that a judge's petition sits 3 feet from you waiting for your signature. I am not leaving this porch. Then stay, Eleanor said, but let me speak. Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she stepped back half a pace, arms crossed close enough to hear every word and far enough to pretend she was granting privacy that didn't exist. Eleanor turned back to Ethan. You said you made a promise to someone 11 months ago. I did. Was that promise to me? Ethan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rough at the edges, stripped of the careful legal calm he'd carried since stepping out of the carriage. I told your uncle the night before you left Richmond that I intended to speak to him about a formal courtship. He told me you'd already refused any further correspondence with me, and that pressing the matter would only embarrass you further. I believed him. I was a fool to believe him, but I believed him because I couldn't imagine why a man would lie about something so easily disproven. I never refused you. I know that now. I waited, Eleanor said, and her voice finally broke. 11 months of it cracking open on a porch in front of her aunt, and a man she'd told herself 100 times to stop thinking about. I waited for a letter. Any letter. I told myself if you truly meant what you'd said to me before you'd write. And when nothing came, I told myself I'd imagined the whole of it, that I'd built something out of a few conversations and a handful of dances that never existed the way I remembered it. It existed. Ethan's voice was quiet, now, quiet and certain. I wrote you 11 letters, Eleanor. I know because I have the 11 drafts I burned when I realized your uncle's household was intercepting the post and I was only making things worse for you by trying. I stopped writing because I thought silence would protect you. That was my mistake to make and I've regretted it every day since. Margaret made a small strangled sound behind them, somewhere between disbelief and fury, but she didn't speak. So, which is it? Eleanor said, wiping at her eyes with the back of one dirt-stained hand, refusing to look away from him, even as her composure cracked. Did you come here for the trust, or did you come here for me? Both, Ethan said simply. I won't insult you by pretending they're separate matters because they aren't. Your uncle used the second to bury the first, and I mean to unbury both. But if you're asking whether I would have ridden 2 days through bad road and worse weather for the paperwork alone, he shook his head once. No, Eleanor, I wouldn't have. The silence that followed had weight to it. The kind of silence that came after something true had finally been said out loud after being buried too long. It was Margaret who broke it, her voice gone unexpectedly gentle. Eleanor, look at the petition. Eleanor looked down at the paper still held against Ethan's chest, and for the first time she reached for it herself, instead of waiting to be handed anything. He let her take it. She unfolded it with hands that trembled only slightly now and read the careful legal script. Her name. Her mother's name. The county records, the language of fraud and mismanagement, and demand for accounting. All of it laid out plain and unflinching by a man who had apparently spent 11 months building a case instead of a courtship, because the courtship had been taken from him before he'd had the chance to finish it properly. There's no place for my signature, she said. I left it blank. Ethan reached into his coat, drew out a small travel inkwell and a folding pen, the kind a man carried when he expected to need them on short notice, on rough roads, at inconvenient hours. In case you said yes. You were that certain of me. No, Ethan said. I was that certain of you deserving the chance to decide for yourself. There's a difference, Eleanor. I learned that the hard way, too. She looked at the pen. She looked at her aunt, who gave the smallest, sharpest nod, the kind of nod that carried a whole lifetime of a woman who'd raised herself up out of her own hard circumstances and wasn't about to watch her niece hand her future to anyone else's decision ever again. She looked finally back at Ethan Caldwell, dust-covered road-weary, standing on her aunt's porch with a leather case full of a truth he could have kept to himself and hadn't. If I sign this, Eleanor said slowly, my uncle will know within the week. He'll know you came here. He'll know I chose you over his arrangement, over his debt, over Mr. Booth, and whatever comfortable lie he told himself about all of it. There's no undoing that. No, Ethan agreed. There isn't. He is still my guardian. Until this is settled, he still has power over where I live, what I'm permitted to do, who I'm permitted to see. Yes, he could make things very difficult for me. He could. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. I won't lie to you and tell you this road is smooth, Eleanor, because you'd see through it in a heartbeat, and you'd be right to distrust me for it. Your uncle is a desperate man, and desperate men do ugly things when they're cornered. But I intend to be standing beside you when he does them this time. Not sending letters he never received. Standing beside you. Eleanor's hand closed around the pen. Eleanor. Margaret's voice was low, urgent, but not discouraging, a warning, not a refusal. Once you sign that there's no quiet way out of this, the whole county will know your business before the month is out. The whole county already thinks I was sent here in disgrace, Aunt Margaret. Eleanor dipped the pen, her hand steadier now than it had been in 11 months. Let them learn the truth instead of the lie. She signed her name at the bottom of the petition, Eleanor Grace Whitfield, in a hand that only shook slightly on the final letter, and when she looked up, Ethan Caldwell was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since the last night she'd spoken to him in Richmond, before everything had gone silent and wrong. Something like relief. Something like pride. Something that had nothing at all to do with trusts or petitions or debts. "It's done," she said, holding the paper out to him. He didn't take it right away. Not quite. "What else is there?" "Your uncle doesn't know I'm here yet. He believes I'm still tangled up in Charleston dealing with the Carolina land matter he arranged to keep me occupied. Which means we have a few days, perhaps a week, if we're fortunate, before he learns any of this has happened. I intend to use that time to file the petition with Judge Hale in Richmond and have him issue an injunction freezing the trust before any wedding arrangement with Mr. Booth can proceed. And if Mr. Booth arrives before that's done..." Ethan's expression hardened just slightly into something Eleanor hadn't seen from him before. Not the calm, legal composure, not the careful gentleness of a moment ago, but something harder underneath, something that had clearly been sharpened by whatever fight he'd already been through to get here. "Then he'll find," Ethan said, "that the woman he's come to collect has already refused the arrangement in writing before a witness, and that any further pressure on the matter will be met by a petition already filed in a Richmond courtroom. I don't intend to let it come to that. But if it does, Eleanor, you won't be facing it alone. Not this time." Margaret let out a long breath, the kind of breath a woman released when she'd been holding herself rigid for longer than she realized. "You'll want to eat something before you ride back, Mr. Caldwell, and change that coat. You look like you slept in a ditch." "I slept in 3 ditches, Mrs. Tolbert. Somewhere between here and the Carolina line. Then you'll eat and you'll rest an hour, and then you'll ride to Richmond before my niece changes her mind out of good sense, which I very much hope she does not do, because I find I rather like the shape of this plan." For the first time since he'd stepped down from that carriage, Ethan Caldwell almost smiled. Eleanor watched him fold the signed petition carefully back into the leather case, watched him close the clasp with the same steady deliberateness. He did everything and felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 11 months. Not hope exactly, not yet. But the ground beneath. Hope, the first solid place to stand after a long time falling. "Ethan?" His name came out of her before she'd decided to say it, and she saw it land on him the way her formality had landed earlier. A small shock, a small opening. "Why didn't you send word ahead? A letter warning me you were coming." "Because I didn't know if a letter would reach you," he said simply. "And because I've learned this past year that some things are worth risking a wasted journey to say to a person's face instead of trusting them to paper. I'd rather have ridden 2 days for nothing than sent a letter that vanished into your uncle's fire before you ever read a word of it." "That's not why," Margaret said, watching him with new, careful eyes. "Tell her the rest of it, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan's jaw tightened. For the first time since arriving, he looked almost uncertain, almost young. "There's a rumor in Richmond," he admitted slowly, "that your uncle intended to have Mr. Booth's proposal accepted and the marriage performed within the week of your arrival here, quickly, before anyone thought to ask questions, using the excuse of your removed circumstances to justify a hasty ceremony without the usual bans or announcement. I couldn't be certain the rumor was true, but I couldn't afford to wait and find out it was." Eleanor felt the blood leave her face. "Within the week?" "That's what I was told." "Then Mr. Booth could already be on the road." "He could. And if he arrives before your petition reaches Judge Hale..." "Eleanor." Ethan's voice was steady, deliberately steady, the voice of a man choosing calm because the alternative served no one. "I am riding for Richmond within the hour. I will reach Judge Hale's chambers by tomorrow evening if the roads hold. He is a fair man and an old friend of my father's, and he will not look kindly on a guardian who spent a ward's inheritance and arranged a marriage to hide the theft. This will move quickly once it moves at all. And until then, Margaret said firmly, stepping forward, "my niece stays under my roof, where I will personally greet any Mr. Harlan Booth who comes up that gravel road with considerably less courtesy than I greeted you, Mr. Caldwell." Something in Eleanor's chest loosened at that, her aunt's fierce, immovable certainty standing between her and every threat that had followed her out of Richmond. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly to both of them, though she wasn't entirely sure which of them she meant it for more. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, the leather case held against his side, the road still written into the dust on his boots, and the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't finished. Your uncle is going to fight this with everything he has, because everything he has is exactly what's at stake for him. It's going to get worse before it gets better. I've already lost 11 months believing you'd forgotten me," Eleanor said. "I think I can survive a fight." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close to it, close enough that Eleanor felt it land somewhere under her ribs. "I never forgot you. Not for a single day of those 11 months. Then don't disappear on me again." "I don't intend to," Ethan said. "Not this time, not ever again if you'll let me stay." Margaret cleared her throat loudly enough to startle a pair of sparrows off the porch railing. "There will be time enough for that conversation once the trust is secured, and my niece's future isn't hanging on a judge's docket, Mr. Caldwell. Eat, rest your horses, then ride." Ethan inclined his head toward her, the picture of chastened respect, though Eleanor caught the corner of his mouth twitching before he mastered it. "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go inside, following Margaret toward the kitchen, and Eleanor stood alone on the porch a moment longer, the folded copy of the trust document still in her hand, the ink of her own signature still drying somewhere inside that leather case. She thought of the woman she'd been 3 days ago, kneeling in the dirt with nothing but a trunk and a letter of arrangement, believing herself abandoned by everyone who might have fought for her. She thought of her uncle sitting in his Richmond study right now, believing his debts were quietly buried, and his niece quietly out of the way, with no notion at all that the ground was already shifting beneath him. She thought of Harlan Booth, a man she had never met, somewhere on a road she couldn't see, riding toward a marriage that no longer existed, though he didn't know it yet. And she thought finally of the carriage sitting at her aunt's gate, 4 horses stamping dust, still settling on the wheels, and the 2 days of hard road Ethan Caldwell had ridden, to bring her a truth he could have kept for himself, and hadn't. Eleanor folded the trust document carefully, and pressed it flat against her chest, the way a woman might hold something she intended never to lose again. The wind moved through the rose hedge. Somewhere down the gravel road, unseen and unknowing, a second carriage was already making its way toward Fairfax County. But for the first time in 11 months, Eleanor Whitfield did not feel like she was standing alone in front of it. Ethan Caldwell did not stop to eat. He said he would, standing on that porch with the leather case tucked against his ribs. But the moment Margaret Tolbert turned toward the kitchen to see about food, he was already calling for his driver to water the horses, instead of unhitching them. Eleanor caught him at the gate, her skirts gathered in one fist, breathless from the run down the garden path. "You said you'd rest an hour." "I lied." He didn't look sorry about it. "Every hour I spend eating soup in your aunt's kitchen is an hour your uncle has to hear I'm not in Charleston anymore. I'd rather reach Judge Hale's door before that word does. Then take this." She pressed a small parcel into his hands, bread wrapped in a cloth napkin, still warm, because apparently some part of her had known he wouldn't stay, even while the rest of her had hoped he would. "Eat it on the road. You look like you'll fall off that horse before Fairfax County's out of sight." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or the particular ache of being taken care of by someone who had every reason not to bother. "Eleanor, go," she said, before either of them could say something neither was ready for yet. "Before I lose my nerve and ask you to stay instead." He went. She stood at the gate long after the carriage had rounded the bend and the dust had settled back down onto the gravel, and it was Margaret's hand on her shoulder, firm and steady, that finally turned her back toward the house. "He'll make it," Margaret said, though nothing in her voice suggested certainty. Only the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to entertain any other outcome out loud. "Now come inside. If your uncle so much as suspects what happened on this porch, we're going to need a plan considerably better than standing in the road wishing him well." Ethan reached the outskirts of Richmond a little after midnight, on the second day his horses lathered his own body. One long ache from collarbone to boot heel, and the leather case still strapped across his chest, like something he intended to defend with his life if it came to that. He did not go to his own lodgings. He went straight to the modest brick house on Grace Street, where Judge Strathmore Hale had lived alone since his wife's passing, and he pounded on the door with the flat of his fist until a light appeared in an upstairs window, and a voice, thick with sleep and irritation, demanded to know what fool was raising the dead at this hour. "It's Caldwell, Judge. I need 10 minutes. There was a long pause, then the sound of a bolt sliding back. Hale opened the door in his nightshirt, a candle in one hand, silver hair standing up on one side of his head, and looked Ethan over from muddy boots to hollow eyes with the flat assessing stare of a man who had spent 40 years on the bench learning to read desperation at a glance. "You look like something a dog wouldn't drag in," Hale said. "Come inside before you wake the whole street." He led Ethan into a study that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old leather, set the candle on the desk, and sat down heavily in the chair behind it without bothering to fetch a robe. "Well, out with it. And it had better be good, because I have court at 9, and I intend to sleep at least 4 more hours of this night." Ethan set the leather case on the desk and opened it with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking from 2 days in the saddle. Henry Whitfield has been drawing against his niece's trust for 6 years. Fairfax County land held for the benefit of Eleanor Grace Whitfield since her mother's death, and he spent the better part of it on gambling debts and a bad tobacco venture. He arranged for his niece to be removed from Richmond 11 days ago under the pretense of a family visit, and he intends to marry her off to a man named Harlan Booth of Petersburg before any accounting can be demanded, a marriage that would clear a debt Whitfield owes to Booth's family and bury the shortfall for good. Hale's sleep-thick expression sharpened by degrees as Ethan spoke, until by the end of it he looked entirely uncomfortably awake. "That is a very serious accusation, Mr. Caldwell. I have certified copies of the land office filings. I have the original trust document held by the county clerk in Fairfax showing the terms of release upon marriage or the ward's 25th birthday. And I have this." Ethan drew out the last paper, the petition Eleanor's signature dried and settled now at the bottom of it. Signed 3 days ago by Eleanor Whitfield herself, before a witness demanding a formal accounting. Hale picked up the petition and read it slowly, his lips moving faintly over certain phrases, the candlelight throwing deep shadows into the lines of his face. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Ethan for a long moment without speaking. "You rode 2 days to bring me this?" "Yes, sir. In the middle of the night. I didn't want to give Whitfield the chance to hear I'd left Charleston before this was in your hands." Hale leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach, and Ethan felt the full weight of the man's scrutiny land on him like a hand pressing down on his shoulder. "And what precisely is your interest in Miss Whitfield's inheritance, Mr. Caldwell? Because I have known you since you were a boy in short trousers following your father around this very courthouse, and I have never once known you to ride 2 days through bad weather for a stranger's paperwork." Ethan didn't flinch from the question, though something in his jaw tightened. "She isn't a stranger, sir." "No," Hale said. "I didn't imagine she was. And I intend to marry her if she'll still have me once this is settled. But I want to be plain with you, Judge, because I know how this will look if I'm not. I am not bringing this petition to clear my own path to her. I'm bringing it because a man is stealing from a young woman who has no one else positioned to stop him, and I happen to be positioned, and so I came." Hale studied him a moment longer, then let out a long breath through his nose, something between amusement and exhaustion. "That is either the most honest thing a man has said in this study in a decade, or the most convincing lie, and at midnight I confess I haven't the energy to tell which. Fortunately for you, the documents will speak for themselves regardless of your intentions." He pulled the petition closer, dipped a pen, and began writing across the bottom margin in a tight economical hand. "I'm issuing a preliminary injunction," he said, without looking up, "freezing any transaction against the Whitfield Trust, including, and I want this stated plainly in the order, any marriage settlement drawn against it, pending a full accounting. I'll have the constable serve notice to Henry Whitfield's residence first thing this morning." "That won't be enough." Hale's pen stopped. "Excuse me. It freezes the trust. It doesn't freeze the marriage. Ethan leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk. If Whitfield's arrangement with Booth was never truly about the trust money itself, but about clearing a personal debt through the marriage, regardless of what happens to the land after Booth's family collects a wife with connections, and Whitfield's debt to them simply disappears as a wedding gift, trust or no trust. An injunction on the property doesn't stop that ceremony from happening. And once it happens, Eleanor's consent to contest anything becomes considerably more complicated because a husband controls his wife's legal standing in nearly every matter that would follow. Hale set the pen down slowly. You're suggesting Whitfield would proceed with the wedding, even knowing the trust itself is frozen. I'm suggesting Whitfield is a desperate man who has already shown he'll lie to a magistrate, intercept his ward's correspondence, and fabricate a legal summons in the Carolinas to remove me from Richmond for the better part of a year. I don't think an injunction on paper is going to slow him down half as much as we'd like to believe. For a long moment, Hale said nothing at all, simply looked at Ethan across the candlelit desk with an expression Ethan couldn't entirely read. You've thought about this a great deal. I've had 11 months with nothing else to think about, sir. Hale huffed something that might have been a laugh in a less exhausted man and reached for a second sheet of paper. Very well. I'll add language explicitly voiding any marriage contract entered into using trust assets as consideration, direct or indirect, pending the outcome of this petition, which ought to give Whitfield's lawyer a considerable headache trying to explain to Booth's family why the debt-clearing arrangement they were promised no longer holds water. But Mr. Caldwell. He looked up, and his voice went hard in a way that hadn't been there a moment before. I want to be entirely clear with you. This injunction protects the property. It does not and cannot prevent Miss Whitfield from marrying Mr. Booth of her own free will, should she choose to do so, regardless of what happens to any trust money attached to it. The law protects her inheritance. It does not and should not presume to protect her from her own decisions. I understand that, sir. Do you? Hale's eyes were sharp now, entirely awake, entirely a judge, and nothing else. Because if any part of your urgency tonight is about ensuring she chooses you, rather than protecting her right to choose at all, I'll tear this petition in half myself and let the court sort out the trust at their own pace. Ethan met his eyes without looking away. If she chooses Booth freely with the full truth in front of her and no one's thumb on the scale, then that's her right, and I'll have no complaint to make about it. All I want is for the choice to be hers. It hasn't been, not once, not for 11 months. That's the only thing I rode here to fix. Hale held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once slowly and signed the order. Henry Whitfield was at breakfast when the constable's knock came, and he would later tell himself he'd known something was wrong the instant he heard it, a particular weight to the sound official and unhurried. Nothing like the tentative rap of a tradesman or the sharp double knock of a neighbor. He was wrong about very little that morning, and that was perhaps the worst part of it. Mr. Whitfield. The constable was a broad, unsmiling man named Grissom, who Henry had exchanged pleasantries with at church for the better part of a decade, and who now looked at him with the flat professional blankness of a man delivering bad news he'd delivered 100 times before. I've an order here from Judge Hale's chambers. Injunction against the Whitfield Trust effective immediately. Henry's hand halfway to his coffee cup went very still. There must be some mistake. No mistake, sir. Order's quite clear. Grissom held out the paper, and Henry took it with fingers that had gone cold despite the warmth of the dining room. Also, names a marriage settlement. Anything drawn against the trust to satisfy a debt direct or otherwise is void under the same order. Judge wanted that part read aloud to you specifically, sir. Those were his words. Henry read the document twice. He understood every word of it and somehow could not make himself believe any of them. Who filed this? Petition was brought by a Miss Eleanor Whitfield, sir, represented by a Mr. Ethan Caldwell. The coffee cup slipped from Henry's hand and shattered against the floor, and he did not so much as glance down at it. That's not possible, he said very quietly, more to himself than to Grissom. Caldwell is in Charleston, He's been in Charleston for months tied up with that land matter. Not according to Judge Hale's chambers, sir. Gentleman filed the petition himself in person near 1 o'clock this morning. Henry sat very still for a long moment, the shattered cup forgotten at his feet, the coffee spreading dark across the floorboards, and felt the entire careful architecture of the last 6 years begin quietly and irreversibly to come apart. "Get out," he said, not to Grissom exactly, but to the room, to the morning, to the whole collapsing shape of his own plans. "Get out, get out! I need to write to Petersburg, immediately." He was already moving before the constable had finished excusing himself, already calling for his own clerk, already drafting in his head the letter that would need to reach Harlan Booth before any word of an injunction did. Because if Booth learned of this before the wedding, if Booth's family learned their debt-clearing marriage had just been legally hollowed out from under them, there would be no debt forgiven and no daughter married, and nothing left standing between Henry Whitfield and a courtroom accounting that would end in his ruin or worse. But Harlan Booth was in fact already 2 days into his journey north when Henry's frantic letter finally caught up with him at a coaching inn outside Petersburg, and he read it 3 times over a cold supper before he fully understood what it was asking of him. He was not, whatever else might be said of him, a stupid man. He had understood from the beginning that the arrangement with Henry Whitfield was not built on affection. His own father had made that plain enough. Sitting him down in the study at home and explaining in the flat, practical language of men discussing livestock that the Whitfield girl came with land and the Booth family's considerable debt to Whitfield's late brother-in-law's estate would be forgiven entire upon the marriage, and that Harlan's own preferences in the matter were regrettably not the deciding factor. He had told himself riding north that it needn't be an unhappy arrangement. He had heard she was pretty. He had heard she was quiet and biddable, which after 2 failed courtships with women considerably less biddable than advertised, had sounded almost like a relief. He had not heard until this letter arriving damp and hastily sealed and reeking faintly of panic that the entire arrangement now rested on getting a wedding performed before some judge in Richmond could finish untangling whatever accounting Whitfield had apparently been avoiding for years. Harlan set the letter down slowly and looked across the table at his traveling companion, his mother's brother, Uncle Dade, a heavy-set man with little patience for delicacy, who had come along ostensibly to see the arrangement properly witnessed, and Harlan suspected to make certain his nephew didn't lose his nerve along the way. "Well," Dade said, reading Harlan's expression rather than the letter itself, "what's the old fool done now? There's an injunction against the trust." Harlan pushed the letter across the table. "He wants us to press on regardless. Have the ceremony performed the moment we arrive before any word of it reaches the young lady or her aunt." Dade read it over his mouth, twisting into something unpleasant. "Sounds to me like the debt forgiveness portion of this arrangement just went up in smoke injunction, or no injunction. A void trust marriage settlement is a void trust marriage settlement, boy. Whitfield can beg all he likes, but if the judge has already ruled the marriage can't touch the trust money, there's nothing left in this for our side of the ledger. Then why does he want us to rush the ceremony at all? Because," Dade said slowly, working it through even as he spoke it aloud, "if the marriage is already performed before the injunction's fully settled, before the girls had a chance to understand any of it or object to any of it, Whitfield's hoping a husband's authority over his new wife might still be worth something to him, even with the trust frozen. Man controls her legal standing. Might still find a way to squeeze something out of that arrangement with the courts, or no arrangement." He shook his head slowly, disgust settling into the lines of his face. "That's a different sort of ugly than what we signed on for Harlan." Harlan sat with that for a long moment, staring at the letter without truly seeing it. "He never told us there was a young woman's own petition against him," he said finally. "He told us it was a straightforward guardianship matter, a trust coming due a marriage that would benefit both families cleanly. He never once mentioned she might not want this, that she might have already gone to a judge to fight it." "No," Dade agreed. "He did not. What kind of man does that make me, Uncle Dade, if I ride into Fairfax County and press a woman into marriage she's already told a court of law she doesn't want simply because her uncle's too much a coward to face his own debts? Honestly?" Dade studied his nephew for a long moment, and something in his heavy, weathered face softened just slightly. "The kind of man your father would be disappointed in if he had any decency left buried under his own debts. But the kind of man I imagine you'd rather not become, if I'm reading you right." "I'd rather not," Harlan said quietly. "Then we ride to Fairfax as planned," Dade said, "because I want to see this Whitfield girl and this Caldwell fellow with my own eyes before I decide anything. But we ride slow, Harlan, and we do not so much as mention the word wedding to anyone until I've had a proper look at what kind of mess your father's debt has actually gotten us tangled up in." The letter reached Margaret Tolbert's house 2 mornings later, carried by a writer Eleanor didn't recognize, and it was addressed not to her, but to her aunt, a fact that made the whole household go quiet and watchful the moment it was noticed. Margaret read it standing in the front hall, her face giving away nothing, while Eleanor hovered close enough to see the paper trembling faintly in her aunt's grip. "What is it?" "Your uncle." Margaret's voice was very controlled, the particular controlled quality of a woman holding back a great deal of fury. "He's written to inform me that he is coming himself, tomorrow, to discuss the matter of your continued residence, and to remind me in language I find frankly insulting, that as your legal guardian, he retains full authority over where you live and who you're permitted to receive as visitors, a clear reference to Mr. Caldwell's visit, though he doesn't name him directly." "He knows then?" "He knows something. Whether he knows the whole of it, I couldn't say." Margaret folded the letter with sharp, precise movements. "He also mentions, and I quote, that arrangements previously discussed remain in effect and will proceed as planned, regardless of any legal distractions currently being pursued." Eleanor felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "Mr. Booth?" "I'd assume so." "Ethan said the injunction would stop the marriage settlement. It stops the trust money from changing hands as part of it." Margaret's jaw was tight. "It doesn't stop your uncle from dragging you in front of a minister regardless if he's desperate enough, and Mr. Booth's family is fool enough to go along with a ceremony that no longer clears their debt. Desperate men don't always act sensibly, Eleanor. Sometimes they act like men with nothing left to lose, which is considerably more dangerous." Eleanor sat down hard on the bottom stair, her legs suddenly unwilling to hold her. "Then we need to send word to Ethan. Now today before my uncle arrives. I've already sent Thomas riding for Richmond." Margaret's voice gentled just slightly, and she crossed the hall to sit beside her niece, taking one of Eleanor's cold hands between both of her own. "He left the moment I finished reading this. If Mr. Caldwell rides through the night as he did before he could be back here by tomorrow evening. Your uncle's letter says tomorrow morning." "Then we have hours, not days." "Yes." "What do we do?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her thumb moving in slow, steadying circles over the back of Eleanor's hand, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone flat and hard in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from her. "We do not let him inside this house alone with you. Not for one moment, not for one private word, because I do not trust what a desperate man might try to convince you of when he's got nothing left to lose, and a great deal of practice manipulating you into believing whatever serves him. Whatever he says tomorrow, Eleanor, you say nothing back except that the matter is before Judge Hale's court and will be settled there. Do you understand me? Nothing else. Not an argument, not an explanation, not a single word he can twist into something useful for himself later. And if he tries to force me to leave with him, he's still my legal guardian." Margaret's expression didn't waver, but something dangerous settled into it. "Then he will have to remove you from my property against your stated will in front of witnesses, while an active petition contesting his guardianship sits on a Richmond judge's desk, and I promise you, child, if he is fool enough to attempt that, he will hand Judge Hale the single clearest piece of evidence of his character that this entire matter could possibly produce." Henry Whitfield did not travel alone. He arrived the following morning with his own lawyer beside him in the carriage. A thin, nervous man named Pruitt, who Eleanor had met perhaps twice in her life, and remembered chiefly for his habit of clearing his throat before every sentence, and the sight of him climbing down from the carriage upright and composed in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed this arrival carefully, sent a cold ripple of dread through Eleanor's chest that she hadn't felt since the morning he'd first told her she was being sent away. "Eleanor?" He didn't look at Margaret at all, addressing her directly the moment he was through the gate, as though her aunt were simply furniture to be stepped around. "I understand you've been engaged in some rather serious mischief in my absence. I've signed a petition, Uncle, requesting an accounting of my mother's trust." Eleanor kept her voice level, though her hands hidden in the folds of her skirt were pressed white-knuckled together. "That isn't mischief. That's my legal right, or so Mr. Caldwell informs me." "Mr. Caldwell." Henry's mouth curled around the name like something distasteful. "A young man with considerably more ambition than sense filling your head with legal theories he understands only well enough to be dangerous with them. I am your guardian, Eleanor. I have managed that trust in your interest since your mother's death, and I do not appreciate having my stewardship questioned by a fortune hunter who's clearly set his sights on what he imagines your inheritance to be worth. Then you'll have no difficulty providing the accounting Judge Hale has requested." Something flickered behind Henry's eyes, the smallest crack in his composure quickly smoothed over. "The accounting will be provided in due course through the proper legal channels, and not because a 19-year-old girl's been frightened into signing papers she doesn't understand by a man attempting to secure her affections through legal maneuvering rather than honest courtship. I'm 1 in 20, Uncle, not 19, and I understood every word of that petition before I signed it." Pruitt cleared his throat, stepping forward with the particular deference of a man who'd been paid to smooth over exactly this sort of moment. "Perhaps, Mr. Whitfield, we might discuss this somewhat more privately." "There will be no private discussion," Margaret said, and her voice cut through the morning air like a dropped pane of glass. "Whatever you have to say to my niece Henry, you'll say it here in front of me, or you'll say nothing at all." Henry's gaze finally shifted to her cold and unfriendly. "This is a family matter, Margaret. She is my sister's daughter. That makes it my family matter as much as yours, and considerably more so given how you've apparently been managing her family's money. You have no legal standing in this." "I have a porch," Margaret said, "and a niece who is welcome to stand on it, and you are welcome to leave whenever you find that arrangement unsatisfactory." For a long, taut moment, nobody spoke. Henry's jaw worked silently, some internal calculation playing out behind his eyes, and Eleanor watched him arrive visibly at a decision he clearly didn't like, but felt he had no better option than to make. "Very well," he said finally. "Then I'll say it here. Eleanor, I have arranged a marriage for you. A good marriage to a respectable family in Petersburg, one that will secure your future considerably better than any romantic notions Mr. Caldwell has planted in your head. Mr. Booth and his uncle are traveling here as we speak, and I expect you to receive them with the courtesy and gratitude the arrangement deserves." "I've never met Mr. Booth in my life." "You'll meet him today then, and you'll find him a perfectly amiable young man, and this entire unpleasant business, with judges and petitions, can be quietly set aside once the ceremony is performed." "The ceremony," Eleanor said slowly, "that Judge Hale has already ruled cannot draw on the trust as a settlement. You're aware of that, Uncle. You must be Judge Hale's order names the marriage arrangement specifically." Something ugly moved across Henry's face there, and gone so quickly Eleanor might have imagined it if she hadn't been watching for exactly that reaction. "The order concerns the trust money. It has no bearing on your marriage itself, which remains entirely within my authority to arrange as your guardian, regardless of what happens to any inheritance attached to it." "Then why arrange it at all?" Margaret said quietly, "if the debt it was meant to clear can no longer be cleared through it. Unless there's a reason beyond the trust money that you haven't mentioned yet, Henry." The silence that followed told Eleanor everything she needed to know, even before her uncle's mouth opened and closed once, without producing any words at all. "That," Henry said, finally, his voice gone tight and cornered, "is a family matter that does not concern you, Margaret. It concerns me a great deal if you intend to march my niece into a marriage that no longer serves the purpose you originally arranged it for, purely out of some remaining spite or debt, or whatever else you haven't had the honesty to name. I am her guardian. You are a man who has spent his ward's inheritance and is now scrambling to marry her off before a judge can ask you to account for it, and every word out of your mouth this morning has confirmed rather than denied it." Margaret stepped forward, putting herself fully between Henry and Eleanor, now her voice low and shaking with a fury she'd clearly been holding in check since the letter arrived 2 days ago. "I want you to leave Henry. Now." And I want you to understand that when Mr. Booth and his uncle arrive, they will hear the truth of this arrangement from my niece's own mouth, whether you like it or not." Henry looked at his sister-in-law for a long, cold moment. And then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, humorless sound that raised the hair on the back of Eleanor's neck. "You think Booth's family cares about the truth of it? They're drowning in the same debt I am, Margaret. That's the whole of the arrangement, not affection, not romance. A mutual debt neatly cancelled between two families who understand exactly how these things work. Do you imagine a young woman's tearful objections are going to matter one whit to a man whose own father's estate depends on this marriage going forward?" "We're about to find out," said a new voice from the gate. "Aren't we?" Every head turned. Harlan Booth stood just inside the fence line, his uncle Dade a step behind him, both men dust-covered from the road, and both wearing expressions that suggested they'd heard rather more of that conversation than Henry Whitfield would have liked. For a moment, nobody moved. Henry recovered first, plastering something that might have passed for a welcoming smile across his face, if anyone present had been fool enough to believe it. "Mr. Booth, Mr. Dade, you've made excellent time. I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." "We made good time," Dade said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "On account of wanting to arrive before you'd had the chance to arrange the young lady's cooperation to your liking. Seems we managed it." "I don't know what you imagine you overheard." "We overheard a young woman say she'd never met my nephew in her life," Dade cut in. "And we overheard you admit plain as day that this marriage isn't about her welfare at all, but about a debt between our families that your own frozen trust can no longer clear. Which raises a rather pressing question, Mr. Whitfield, that my nephew and I discussed at some length on the road here. If the marriage no longer clears your debt to us, what exactly were you hoping to gain by rushing us into a ceremony this morning?" Henry's composure cracked fully for the first time, something desperate and ugly surfacing beneath it. "The debt can still be settled, once the trust matter resolves in my favor, which it won't," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt, "if the accounting shows what I believe it will show." Harlan Booth looked at her directly for the first time. Really looked the way a person looks at someone they're trying to understand rather than simply assess, and something in his face shifted, uncertain and searching. "Miss Whitfield, is it true you never consented to this arrangement, that you've already gone before a judge to contest it?" "It's true," Eleanor said. 3 days ago, I signed a petition demanding a full accounting of my mother's trust, which my uncle has been drawing against for 6 years without my knowledge. I've never met you before this morning, Mr. Booth, and whatever my uncle told your family about this arrangement, I promise you it did not include my consent, because no one ever asked for it." Harlan's jaw tightened, and he turned to look at Henry with an expression that had gone from wary to genuinely disgusted. "You told my father this was a mutually agreeable arrangement, both families benefiting. You never once mentioned she'd have to be talked into it, or that she'd already refused it formally before a court." "She's a foolish girl who's had her head turned by a young man with no fortune and considerable nerve. She sounds," Dade said dryly, "like a young woman with rather more sense than the man trying to marry her off against her will." "Harlan." He turned to his nephew, and something like decision settled over his heavy features. "I believe we've seen enough." "Wait." Henry's voice cracked all pretense of composure, gone now, naked panic bleeding through. "Wait, please, Dade. Be reasonable. The debt still stands regardless of how this looks. Your family still owes. My family owes considerably less than yours does at this point. Whitfield, given what a Richmond judge is about to uncover about your handling of trust funds." Dade's voice was hard now, final. "We rode here in good faith, believing this was a fair arrangement between two families in difficulty. We did not ride here to press an unwilling young woman into marriage to cover up your theft. Harlan, we're leaving." "Wait," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself as much as anyone. Everyone turned to look at her. "Mr. Booth." She stepped forward past her aunt, meeting his eyes directly. "For whatever it's worth, I don't think this was your doing. You didn't know the truth of it any more than I was given the chance to. If you're willing, I think Judge Hale would want to hear what you've heard here this morning. It might matter when the accounting comes due." Harlan studied her for a long moment, something like respect moving across his face. You'd ask that of me, after everything my family agreed to. I'd ask it because you rode 2 days to marry a stranger to settle your father's debt, and the moment you learned the truth, you chose not to go through with it anyway. That says something about the kind of man you are, Mr. Booth, and I don't think it's an unkind thing. Harlan glanced at his uncle, who gave a short decisive nod, and then back at Eleanor. We'll speak to the judge. Gladly. I want no part of whatever your uncle's built here, Miss Whitfield, and I'd rather see it unraveled honestly than have my family's name attached to the wreckage of it. Henry stood frozen at the center of it all, watching the last of his carefully constructed arrangement collapse in real time. Watching the two families he'd meant to bind together through mutual desperation, instead turn together against him. This isn't finished, he said, low and furious, backing toward his carriage. You'll regret this, Eleanor. All of you will. Perhaps, Margaret said, unmoved. But I imagine we'll regret it considerably less than you're about to regret the last 6 years, Henry. He climbed into his carriage without another word, Pruitt scrambling in after him, and the wheels tore up the gravel road in a spray of dust and fury that felt to Eleanor like the exact sound of a man's last plan falling apart around him. It was nearly evening when the second carriage arrived. Ethan's dust-covered and travel-worn, the horses blown from another hard ride, and Eleanor was out the gate before he'd even brought them to a full stop, her heart hammering with a fear that hadn't fully released her since the moment her uncle's carriage had disappeared down the road that morning. He knows, she said before Ethan had even climbed down. He came here himself this morning with his lawyer, and he tried to force the marriage forward anyway, and Mr. Booth's family. I know. Ethan's face was grim, streaked with road dust, but there was something steady underneath the exhaustion, something that hadn't been there before. I passed a rider on the road not 2 hours from Richmond. Booth and his uncle headed for Judge Hale's chambers of their own accord to give testimony. I stopped them long enough to hear the whole of it. Then he knows he's lost the marriage arrangement entirely. He does. Which means... Ethan said, his voice going quieter, more careful. He's about to become considerably more dangerous than he was this morning, Eleanor. A man with a plan is predictable. A man who's just watched his last plan collapse in front of witnesses is not. Margaret, standing on the porch, folded her arms tightly across her chest. What did Judge Hale say when Mr. Booth arrives to testify? I don't know yet. I rode straight here the moment I heard to make sure. He stopped himself, and something in his face softened as he looked at Eleanor, taking in properly for the first time since arriving the particular exhausted fear still written across her features. To make sure you were safe. That's the whole of why I came instead of waiting in Richmond for the ruling. I'm safe, Eleanor said, though her voice shook slightly on the words. For now. For now isn't good enough, Ethan said, low and certain. Not anymore. Not after today. Margaret's sharp eyes moved between them, weighing something, and then she let out a long breath. Come inside, both of you. Whatever comes next, it won't be decided standing in the road as the light goes. But even as they turned toward the house, Eleanor felt it, the same cold, unsettled feeling that had followed her since the carriage wheels first sounded on the gravel road 4 days ago. The sense that the ground beneath this fragile new safety was still shifting, still unfinished, and that somewhere out past the tree line, her uncle was already deciding what he meant to do about all of it. Henry Whitfield did not go home that night. He went to Petersburg instead, alone, without Pruitt, without a word to anyone about where he was headed, and he arrived at the modest brick house belonging to Harlan Booth's father, a little after 9 in the evening, road-weary and half out of his mind, with the particular panic of a man watching every door close on him, one after another. Old Mr. Booth received him in his study, and Henry did not waste time on pleasantries. Your son and your brother have gone to Richmond to testify against me. So I've heard. The elder Booth did not rise from his chair, did not offer Henry a seat, and his voice carried none of the easy cordiality it had held during their earlier correspondence about the arrangement. Dade sent word by rider not 2 hours ago. Seems there's rather more to this business than what you told me, Whitfield. There's nothing to it beyond a headstrong girl and an ambitious young man filling her head with nonsense. There's an injunction from a Richmond judge is what there is. Booth's voice hardened. And a young woman who apparently never agreed to marry my son in the first place, which you neglected to mention when you sat in this very room and told me the arrangement was settled and only wanted the ceremony performed. You lied to me, Whitfield, in my own house. I did what was necessary to see two families through a difficult time. You did what was necessary to see yourself through a difficulty you created alone by spending money that wasn't yours. And you very nearly dragged my son into standing up in a church and marrying an unwilling girl to cover it. Booth stood now finally, and there was nothing warm left in his face at all. I want no further part of this, and I'll thank you to leave my house before I have you removed from it. Henry stood in the doorway for a long moment, his last remaining ally gone cold and final in front of him, and felt something in his chest curdle into pure desperation. There must be something, he said low, almost pleading. Some arrangement still to be made. If not the marriage, then there is nothing further to discuss. Booth's voice was flat, immovable. Good evening, Mr. Whitfield. Henry left the house with his hands shaking, climbed back into his carriage, and sat for a long while in the dark without telling his driver where to go next, because for the first time in 6 years, he genuinely did not know. Judge Strathmore Hale's chambers, 3 days later, were not designed to intimidate a modest room lined with law books, a single tall window, a desk scarred from decades of use. But Eleanor felt the full weight of it the moment she stepped through the door. Ethan's hand steady at the small of her back, her aunt walking close on her other side like a woman prepared to physically place herself between Eleanor and anything that came at her. Henry was already seated alone, Pruitt beside him, looking considerably less confident than he had a week earlier. Harlan Booth and his Uncle Dade sat across the room, and when Eleanor's eyes met Harlan's, he gave her a small, steady nod. Not warmth exactly, but something like solidarity between two people who'd both nearly been made into pawns in someone else's desperate game. Judge Hale entered from a side door, robes already on, despite the informality of the setting, and took his seat behind the desk with the particular unhurried authority of a man who had spent 40 years learning that silence held long enough made people say more than questions ever could. He let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. This is not a formal hearing, he said. I've called this meeting to review the accounting Mr. Whitfield's counsel was ordered to produce and to determine whether the matter proceeds to a full trial or resolves here. Mr. Pruitt, I understand you've brought the requested records. Pruitt cleared his throat, the sound thin and nervous in the small room. Your Honor, that is my client. We have encountered some difficulty in assembling the complete. Mr. Pruitt? Hale's voice didn't rise, but something in it went very cold. I gave your client 8 days. That is considerably more generosity than most guardians accused of 6 years of undocumented withdrawals from a ward's trust would receive from this court. Do you have the records or do you not? We have partial records, Your Honor. How partial? Pruitt's throat worked visibly before he answered. Approximately 40% of the requested documentation, Your Honor. My client indicates that certain records were lost during a house fire some years prior. There was no fire, Eleanor said. Every head in the room turned toward her. Margaret's hand closed sharply around her arm, not to silence her. Eleanor understood immediately, but in support, steadying rather than restraining. Hale's eyebrows rose slightly. Miss Whitfield, you have something to add? There was never a fire, Your Honor. I lived in that house for 6 years. I would remember a fire that destroyed my mother's estate records. My uncle told me when I was 17 that the records were simply kept at his solicitor's office in Petersburg for safekeeping. He never once mentioned any fire until this moment. Henry's face had gone the color of old paper. She's confused. It was some years before she came to live with me permanently. The timeline is... The timeline, Hale said, cutting him off with a single flat sentence, is a matter this court intends to establish with rather more precision than your memory appears able to provide, Mr. Whitfield. He turned back to Pruitt. 40%. What does that 40% show? Pruitt shuffled his papers, and Eleanor could see, even from across the room, the fine tremor in his hands. It shows. Withdrawals, Your Honor. Regular withdrawals over a period of approximately 6 years, drawn against the principal of the Fairfax County Land Trust. For what stated purpose? Various purposes, Your Honor. Maintenance of the ward. Educational expenses. Household. Read me the figures for the past 18 months specifically, Hale said, since that is conveniently the period for which your client claims the most complete records exist. Pruitt read them. The numbers spoken aloud in that quiet room landed like stones, dropped one after another into still water. Sums far beyond anything a young woman's maintenance or education could reasonably account for, sums that climbed steadily higher in the months immediately following what Eleanor now understood must have been a losing season at the card tables, or a failed tobacco contract, or whatever combination of Henry's private disasters had driven him to keep dipping deeper into money that was never his. Mr. Whitfield. Hale's voice when Pruitt finished was very quiet, and somehow that quiet was worse than any shout could have been. Would you care to explain to this court what portion of $1,100 withdrawn in March of this year alone went toward your niece's education? Henry said nothing. Mr. Whitfield. There were expenses, Henry said finally, his voice cracking around the edges. Household expenses. A guardian has considerable latitude in managing a ward's funds for the ward's benefit, Hale said. Not for his own. I have sat on this bench for 4 decades. Mr. Whitfield and I have seen a great many creative explanations for missing money in that time. I have rarely seen one this thin. He set down the papers. I am ordering a full forensic accounting conducted by the court's own appointed examiner, with access to every bank record, every solicitor's file, and every land office document connected to this trust for the full 6 years of your guardianship. You will bear the cost of that examination personally, Mr. Whitfield, and you will cooperate fully, or I will hold you in contempt and have the sheriff assist your memory. Your Honor, this is considerably more patience than the law strictly requires me to show you. Hale said, given what I've already seen this morning, I'd advise you to use it wisely. Henry sat frozen, and Eleanor watched something in her uncle's posture finally visibly break. Not the sharp collapse of a man caught in a single lie, but the slow grinding collapse of a man who had built his entire life on a foundation he'd known deep down could not hold, and who was only now in this small, quiet room, being made to watch it come down, floor by floor. There's something else, Your Honor, Ethan said, stepping forward for the first time. Hale's attention shifted to him. Mr. Caldwell, during my own review of the Fairfax County Land Office records conducted, I should say plainly before this petition was filed, and entirely at my own initiative, I found something that may be relevant to the court's understanding of Mr. Whitfield's financial position. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat. A separate deed, recorded 8 months ago. 40 acres of the Whitfield family's own land, not the trust land, but land belonging to Henry Whitfield personally, quietly sold to a buyer in Petersburg. The proceeds were never disclosed in any correspondence I've reviewed regarding the estate. Henry's head snapped up. Where did you get that? Public record, Mr. Whitfield. Anyone with the patience to search the county office could have found it. Ethan held the deed out, and the bailiff crossed to take it and pass it to the judge. I raise it because if Mr. Whitfield sold his own land 8 months ago, and the proceeds are not reflected anywhere in his current finances, the court might reasonably ask where that money went, and whether it too disappeared into the same debts that appear to have consumed the trust. Hale read the deed slowly, his expression darkening with each line. Mr. Whitfield, where are the proceeds from this sale? Silence. Mr. Whitfield. Gone. Henry said finally, barely above a whisper, all the fight suddenly gone out of him at once, like a man who had simply run out of road to keep running down. It's gone. All of it. There's nothing left, Your Honor. There hasn't been anything left for over a year. The room went very still. Gone where? Hale said. Henry's hands were shaking now visibly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the cold authority he'd carried into this room. Cards. Tobacco contracts that failed 2 seasons running. A loan I took against my own name that I couldn't repay, so I borrowed against hers, instead telling myself I'd replace it before she ever needed to know. And then I couldn't replace that either. And then... He stopped pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes. And then, Booth's family's debt looked like the only door left. I told myself if the marriage went through quietly, no one would ever have to look closely enough to see any of this. I told myself I was protecting her from the shame of it. You were protecting yourself, Eleanor said, and her voice when it came was steadier than she expected it to be, not shaking with fear anymore, but with something colder and more certain. From the shame of what you'd done to money that belonged to a dead woman's only child. Don't you dare stand there and call it protection, Uncle. Henry didn't answer her. He didn't look at her at all. Hale let the silence hold a long moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried the full final weight of the bench. Henry Whitfield, this court finds sufficient cause based on your own admission to proceed to formal judgment on the petition before it. You will surrender all authority as trustee and guardian of Eleanor Grace Whitfield's estate, effective immediately. A full forensic accounting will proceed at your expense to determine the complete extent of the shortfall, and this court will refer the matter to the county prosecutor for consideration of criminal charges related to fraud and misappropriation of trust property. Given Miss Whitfield's age of majority, and the clear and repeated abuse of guardianship demonstrated in this proceeding, I am also terminating your guardianship over her person effective today. Miss Whitfield is free to determine her own residence and affairs without further reference to you. Henry sat frozen staring at nothing, and Eleanor watched the last 6 years of careful lies come apart in front of a room full of witnesses, and felt beneath the shock and the grief of it, because it was grief even now. Grief for the uncle she'd once trusted before she'd ever had reason not to, something that felt almost like breathing for the first time in a long while. Your Honor? Harlan Booth stood suddenly, and every head turned toward him. For what it's worth, my family withdraws any claim connected to this arrangement. Whatever debt Mr. Whitfield believed this marriage would settle, we consider it void, given what's been revealed here today. We want no part of it. Noted Mr. Booth, though it was hardly the court's to enforce in the first place, given the injunction already in place. Hale allowed himself something almost like a small tired smile. But it's decent of you to say so plainly. Harlan glanced once at Eleanor, a small rueful smile of his own. Seemed the right thing to do, Your Honor. Miss Whitfield's had enough men deciding things for her without her consent. I didn't care to add my name to that list. They left the courthouse a little after noon, and Eleanor did not fully understand how close she'd come to breaking down entirely until she was outside in the open air with Ethan's hand under her elbow and her aunt on her other side, and the whole overwhelming weight of the morning finally caught up to her all at once. I need to sit down, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. I need just a moment. There's a bench, Margaret said quickly, already steering her toward it. Here, sit. Eleanor sat and pressed both hands against her face, and for a long moment simply breathed in, out, while the sounds of the Richmond street carried on around her, indifferent to the fact that her entire life had just been rearranged in the space of 1 hour. He admitted it, she said, finally muffled behind her hands. In front of everyone. He just admitted it. He did. Ethan crouched down in front of the bench level with her, his voice gentle in a way she hadn't heard from him since the porch, since before all the paperwork and petitions and legal maneuvering had taken over every conversation between them. It's over, Eleanor. The guardianship, the marriage arrangement, all of it. You're free of him. Am I? She lowered her hands, and her eyes were wet, though she hadn't quite let herself cry yet. He spent it, Ethan. Whatever's left of my mother's land, whatever's left of that trust, he spent most of it, didn't he? I heard the numbers. I understood what they meant even before he admitted the rest of it. Ethan didn't try to soften it. There will likely be a shortfall, a significant one. The forensic accounting will tell us exactly how much, but I won't pretend to you that it's likely to be small. So I've won a lawsuit and lost my inheritance anyway. You've won your freedom. Margaret said firmly, sitting on Eleanor's other side and taking her hand. That was never a small thing, whatever's left of the money. You are no longer answerable to that man for one single decision about your own life, Eleanor. That is not nothing. That is in fact considerably more than most young women in your position are ever given. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment, staring at nothing, and slowly, gradually felt something in her chest begin to loosen that had been wound tight since the morning her uncle's letter first arrived 11 days ago. "What happens to him now?" she asked finally. "To my uncle. That depends on the prosecutor," Ethan said, "and on what the full accounting shows. It's possible he faces criminal charges. It's possible if the amount is smaller than it appears and he cooperates fully with restitution, that it resolves as a civil matter instead. That isn't something any of us control from here." "Do you think he'll go to prison?" Ethan was quiet a moment, choosing his words with visible care. "I think Henry Whitfield made choices over a period of years that he knew were wrong at the time he made them, and that the consequences of those choices are no longer within his power to control. Whatever happens to him now, Eleanor, it happened because of decisions he made, not because of anything you or I did in bringing them to light." "I know that." Her voice was quiet. "I do know that. He raised me, Ethan. Whatever else he did, he was the only family I had left after my mother died, and some part of me keeps waiting to feel angrier than I do, and instead, I mostly just feel tired." "That's grief," Margaret said gently, squeezing her hand. "It's allowed to look like tired, Eleanor. It doesn't have to look like anything in particular." They did not linger in Richmond. Ethan arranged rooms for the three of them at a respectable inn near the courthouse, insisting Eleanor and her aunt rest before the long ride back to Fairfax. And it was over a quiet supper that evening, the first real meal any of them had eaten since breakfast, and the first moment of true stillness since the carriage had first arrived at Margaret's gate 11 days earlier, that Ethan finally set down his fork and looked across the table at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "There's something I haven't said yet," he told her. "And I think today of all days is the day to say it rather than let it wait any longer." Margaret, with the tact of a woman who understood precisely when her presence was no longer required at a table, rose and murmured something about checking on the horses, and left the two of them alone in the small private dining room, the candle between them throwing soft light across the worn wood of the table. "You're worrying me, Ethan." "I don't mean to." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, waiting instead for permission that she gave by turning her palm up to meet his. 11 months ago, before any of this happened, before your uncle sent you away, before I was called to Charleston on a summons, I now know he arranged. I told you I intended to speak to your uncle about a formal courtship. Do you remember that conversation?" "I remember every word of it." "Then you remember I told you that night that I didn't intend to waste time being cautious about what I wanted. That I'd watched my own father die slowly of caution, of waiting for the perfect circumstance, the perfect moment, and losing everything that mattered to him in the waiting." Ethan's thumb moved slowly over the back of her hand. "I've had 11 months to think about what I'd say to you if I ever got the chance to say it properly. I've rehearsed it more times than I'd like to admit. Say it then." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was no hesitation in it. "Whatever it is, I think we've both waited long enough." "I love you," Ethan said simply. No flourish to it. No rehearsed poetry, just plain and steady as the man himself. "I loved you 11 months ago before any of this began, and I love you now having watched you stand in that courtroom today and face down the man who raised you with more courage than I've seen from grown men twice your age. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, Eleanor. You've had an exhausting day, and you deserve time to simply feel whatever you need to feel about your uncle, about the money, about all of it, without any pressure from me added on top of it. But I needed you to know it, plainly. Without any legal papers between us this time." Eleanor sat very still for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with something that was equal parts grief and relief, and a joy she hadn't let herself feel fully in longer than she could remember. "I loved you before any of this began, too," she said. I told myself I'd imagined it these past 11 months. I told myself a girl doesn't build a whole life around a handful of conversations and a few dances. But I never stopped, Ethan. Not for one single day of the silence. I just didn't let myself say it out loud, because I was so certain you'd stopped. Never, Ethan said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. Not for one day. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The candle burned low between them, and outside the window, Richmond settled into evening, indifferent to the two people finally quietly coming back together after 11 months of silence neither of them had chosen. They returned to Fairfax County 3 days later, and Eleanor had barely stepped down from the carriage before she understood from the look on her aunt's face that something new had happened in their absence. "There's a letter," Margaret said, holding out a folded paper with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. "From the court examiner. It arrived yesterday." Eleanor took it with hands that had gone suddenly cold and read it standing right there in the yard, Ethan close beside her, his hand steady at her back. The forensic accounting had moved faster than any of them expected. Judge Hale, it seemed, had pressed the examiner hard, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, the particular urgency of a young woman's future hanging in the balance. The preliminary findings were laid out in plain, unforgiving language of the original trust, valued at just over $11,000 at the time of Eleanor's mother's death. Approximately $7,000 had been withdrawn or otherwise diverted over the 6 years of Henry Whitfield's guardianship. What remained, the land itself still intact, still legally hers, was valued at roughly $4,000, considerably less than what should have been hers by right, but far from nothing. $4,000, Eleanor said slowly, reading it again to make certain she hadn't misunderstood. "The land is still mine. Whatever else he took, he never managed to sell the land itself. He likely didn't dare," Ethan said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "Selling trust land outright would have required documentation he couldn't easily fabricate, draining the income, the cash reserves that he could hide behind vague household expenses for years. The land itself was harder to touch without leaving an obvious trail. So I have a home." Eleanor's voice wavered between disbelief and something that might eventually become joy once the shock of it settled. "Somewhere that's actually legally mine, not borrowed, not dependent on anyone's guardianship or goodwill." "You do," Margaret said, and there were tears in her eyes now, unashamed. "For the first time in your life, Eleanor, you have something that is entirely, unquestionably your own." Eleanor stood in the yard, with the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and felt the full weight of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks finally begin to settle into something like solid ground beneath her feet. Not the ground she'd expected, not the life she'd imagined for herself even a month earlier, but ground, nonetheless, hers to build on however she chose. "There's a house on that land," she said slowly, almost to herself. "Isn't there? My mother's house. I haven't seen it since I was a small girl." "There is," Ethan confirmed. "I inquired while I was arranging the injunction. It stood empty for years. Your uncle rented the farmland to tenants, but left the house itself untouched, likely because selling or altering it would have drawn more attention than he wanted." "I want to see it." "Then we'll go," Ethan said simply. "Whenever you're ready." They rode out to the Fairfax land 2 days later, and Eleanor felt her breath catch somewhere in her chest at her first sight of it in over a decade. A modest farmhouse, weathered but sound, sitting on a rise above fields that had clearly been worked and tended even through the years of her uncle's neglect. Because a tenant farmer, it turned out, had been quietly keeping the place from ruin out of what he later told them was simple decency, having heard rumors for years that the true owner might someday return to claim it. "It's smaller than I remember," Eleanor said, standing in the overgrown dooryard, her voice thick. "I suppose everything looks larger when you're 7 years old." "It's not small," Margaret said gently, coming to stand beside her. "It's exactly the right size for a young woman starting her life over on her own terms." Eleanor walked through the empty rooms, slowly running her hand along dusty windowsills and door frames, feeling the particular ache of a memory, only half formed. A mother's voice. She could barely recall a kitchen that had once smelled of bread and now smelled only of disuse and years of closed windows. In the front room, faded but still visible, hung a small portrait she hadn't expected to find at all. Her mother, young, smiling, painted not long before her death, left behind, because Henry, in his haste to remove every trace of inconvenient sentiment from his own house, had apparently never thought to claim it for himself. Eleanor stood in front of that portrait for a long time, and Ethan, standing quietly in the doorway, did not intrude on the moment, only waited patient and steady until she was ready to turn around. "I want to live here," she said finally, wiping at her eyes. "Not stay with Aunt Margaret out of necessity, not wait for someone else to decide what becomes of my life. I want to live in my mother's house on my mother's land, and build something of my own here." "Then that's what we'll do," Margaret said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. "I'll help you set it right. It'll want considerable work before winter, but it's sound and it's yours, and that's worth more than a great deal of comfort borrowed from someone else's roof." Eleanor looked at Ethan, then standing quiet in the doorway, with that same patient steadiness he'd carried since the moment he'd stepped down from his carriage nearly 2 weeks earlier, and felt something settle fully into place inside her chest for the first time since this whole impossible chain of events had begun. "And you," she said. "Where do you fit into all this, Ethan Caldwell?" "Wherever you'll have me," he said simply. "I'm not in any hurry, Eleanor. You've spent your whole life having decisions made for you by other people. I don't intend to become one more man rushing you toward an answer before you're ready to give it. Rebuild your house first. Rebuild your life on your own ground in your own time. I'll be here when you're ready for the rest of it, however long that takes." Eleanor crossed the small dusty room and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, the way she hadn't quite dared to do even in Richmond, even after everything. "I don't think it'll take very long," she said softly. "But I thank you for the patience all the same." Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long and gold across fields that were for the first time in Eleanor Whitfield's adult life entirely and unquestionably her own. And somewhere behind them, in a Richmond courtroom, the last chapter of Henry Whitfield's carefully constructed lies was only beginning to be written in full, though none of them yet knew exactly how it would end. The letter from the county prosecutor arrived on a Tuesday, and it was Margaret who saw the writer first coming up the gravel road at a pace that made her set down her mending and go still on the porch. Because in the last 2 weeks, she had learned to read a great deal into the speed of an approaching horse. "Eleanor." Her voice carried through the open window sharp enough to bring Eleanor in from the garden with dirt still on her hands. "Rider coming, moving fast." Eleanor reached the porch just as the young man swung down breathless and held out a sealed letter bearing the county seal. "For Miss Eleanor Whitfield, from the prosecutor's office in Richmond." Her fingers weren't quite steady as she broke the seal, and Ethan, who had ridden out from his own business in town not an hour earlier to help assess the state of the farmhouse roof, before winter set in, came around the side of the house at the sound of the rider's arrival and crossed the yard in a few long strides, reading her face rather than the letter. "What is it?" "They've formally charged him." Eleanor's voice was strange to her own ears, not triumphant, not exactly relieved, something more complicated sitting underneath both of those feelings. "Fraud. Misappropriation of trust property. The forensic examiner completed the full accounting. $7,140, Ethan. That's the final figure. That's what he took. And the charge. A trial date. 6 weeks from now." She looked up from the paper, and her eyes had gone glassy, though she couldn't have said in the moment whether it was grief or fury, or simply the exhaustion of an ordeal that kept refusing to end. "They want me to testify." Margaret's hand found her shoulder immediately steady and firm. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Eleanor. Not one thing. I know that." Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her jaw tightening with a resolve that surprised even her. "But I think I want to. I think I need to sit in that courtroom and say out loud in front of everyone exactly what he did not, because I want to see him punished, though God knows he's earned it, but because I spent 6 years being told I was imagining things, being told I was ungrateful, being told a good niece didn't ask so many questions about money that wasn't rightfully hers to control in the first place. I think I need to hear myself say the truth of it once where it counts." Ethan didn't try to talk her out of it. He simply nodded slow and steady, the particular nod of a man who understood exactly what she meant and respected her too much to soften it for her. "Then I'll be there. Every day of it, if you'll have me." "I will." May. The 6 weeks that followed were not quiet ones. Word had spread through the county the way word always spread in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not. And Eleanor found herself for the first time in her life the subject of considerable public conversation. Some of it sympathetic, a great deal of it not. She heard about the worst of it secondhand through Margaret, who came home from the dry goods store one afternoon with her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line, and refused to say what had happened until Eleanor pressed her 3 separate times. "Mrs. Aldridge," Margaret said, finally setting down her basket with more force than strictly necessary, had the gall to suggest in front of the entire store that no properly raised young woman ought to be dragging her own uncle's name through a public courtroom, whatever he may or may not have done with her money. "What did you say to her?" "I said," Margaret replied with a certain grim satisfaction, "that no properly raised uncle ought to have spent his dead sister's daughter's inheritance on card tables and bad tobacco speculation, and that if Mrs. Aldridge found the truth more scandalous than the theft itself, that said rather more about Mrs. Aldridge's priorities than my niece's character." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, not quite shame because she refused to let herself feel shame over something she hadn't done, but the particular sting of knowing that her name, her family's private ruin, was now fodder for every gossiping tongue in 3 counties. "They'll say what they like," she said slowly, more to convince herself than her aunt. "They said plenty when I was sent away in disgrace too, and none of it was true then either." "They will say what they like," Margaret agreed. "And you will hold your head up through every word of it because you have done nothing wrong. Eleanor and I will not have you carrying shame that belongs entirely to your uncle." But it was harder than either of them wanted to admit in practice to hold that resolve steady, day after day, harder still, when 3 weeks before the trial, Eleanor rode into town for supplies, and found herself face to face entirely, without warning, with a woman she vaguely recognized as a distant cousin of her uncle's late wife. "Eleanor Whitfield." The woman's voice carried deliberately across the general store, drawing eyes from every corner of it. "I heard you've taken up with that Caldwell fellow. Quite convenient, isn't it, that your uncle's misfortune happens to leave you free to marry wherever you like with land of your own besides? Some might call that fortunate timing." The words landed like a slap, and for one terrible moment, Eleanor felt the old instinct rise in her, the instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller and quieter, until the accusation lost interest and moved on to someone else. She had spent 6 years perfecting that instinct under her uncle's roof. She did not give in to it. "My uncle spent 6 years stealing from a trust that belonged to a dead woman's only child," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just as clearly across the store steady, despite the hammering of her own heart. "The land I have is what remains of what he didn't manage to take. I'd call that considerably less fortunate than simply having never been robbed in the first place. But you're welcome to your opinion of the timing, ma'am." The woman's mouth opened and closed once, clearly unprepared for the response, and Eleanor didn't wait to see what she might say next. She paid for her purchases with hands that were shaking only slightly, and walked out of that store with her chin level and her shoulders square, and did not let herself cry until she was well down the road toward home. Ethan found her there on the road, sitting on a fallen log with her basket set down beside her and her face still wet, and he didn't say anything at first, simply sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and waited. "I thought it would get easier," Eleanor said finally. "The talk. I thought once the truth came out, once it was all laid plain in front of a judge, people would simply understand and move on. I was foolish to think that." "You weren't foolish." Ethan's voice was quiet. "You were hopeful. There's a difference, and I don't think you should be ashamed of the second one, even when the world insists on disappointing it. A woman in the store today as good as called me a fortune hunter. Said it was convenient my uncle's ruin, since it left me free to marry you with land of my own." She laughed short and humorless. As if I asked for any of this. As if I wouldn't give back every acre of it to have had an honest guardian instead. I know that, Ethan said. And so does everyone who actually knows you, Eleanor. The rest of them. He shook his head slowly. The rest of them will believe whatever story is easiest for them to tell, regardless of the truth in front of them. That's not a fight you can win by being quieter or smaller or more agreeable. I learned that myself watching my own father's estate torn apart by rumor 20 years ago. The only thing that ever actually changes people's minds is time, and seeing you live your life honestly in front of them long enough that the gossip simply runs out of new lies to tell. That could take years. It could? He took her hand, turning it over gently in his own, tracing the calluses she'd earned from weeks of working the neglected garden at her mother's farmhouse. I'm not in a hurry, Eleanor. I told you that once already and I meant it. Whatever years it takes, I'd rather spend them beside you than anywhere else. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest, still raw from the encounter in the store, eased just slightly at the plain steadiness of him. No grand declarations. No rush to fix what couldn't be fixed by force of will alone. Just the simple fact of him sitting beside her on a fallen log, willing to wait out whatever the world had left to throw at her. Thank you, she said quietly, for not telling me it doesn't matter what they say. It does matter, Ethan said. Pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. But it matters less than what you know to be true about yourself, and considerably less than what the law is about to make undeniable in a Richmond courtroom in 3 weeks' time. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in late autumn, and Eleanor sat in the front row of the gallery between Margaret and Ethan, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching her uncle be led in by a bailiff, thinner than she remembered him. His fine clothes replaced by something plainer, something that made him look older and smaller than the man who had once ruled every corner of her childhood, with cold, unquestionable authority. He did not look at her. The prosecution's case moved with the same relentless methodical precision that had characterized the forensic accounting itself, witness after witness, document after document, each one adding another brick to a wall that Henry Whitfield's lawyer, a considerably more competent man than Pruitt had proven to be, tried valiantly, and largely unsuccessfully, to knock down. Eleanor testified on the third day. She had rehearsed what she meant to say 100 times in the weeks leading up to it, lying awake in her mother's old farmhouse, listening to the wind move through fields that were finally legally hers. And yet when she actually stood in the witness box, facing a room full of strangers, and her uncle's flat, unreadable stare, every rehearsed word deserted her at once, and she found herself speaking instead from somewhere rawer and more honest than any prepared speech could have reached. He told me, she said in answer to the prosecutor's question about her understanding of her own finances growing up, that I had nothing of my own, that everything I had, my food, my clothes, my education, was a kindness he extended to me out of family obligation since my mother had left nothing behind worth speaking of. I believed him. I believed him for 6 years, Your Honor. Because I had no reason not to, and because a girl raised to trust her guardian doesn't generally think to demand an accounting of a man who's raised her since she was 15 years old. And when did you first learn that account was untrue? The day Mr. Caldwell arrived at my aunt's gate with a copy of the trust document. That was the first day in 6 years I understood I had ever had anything of my own at all. Henry's lawyer on cross-examination tried a different approach entirely. Gentler, more sympathetic in tone, clearly hoping to paint Eleanor as a confused young woman, manipulated by an ambitious suitor, rather than a woman capable of understanding her own circumstances. Miss Whitfield, isn't it true that your relationship with Mr. Caldwell began before any of these allegations against your uncle surfaced? It began before I knew about the theft, yes. So it's fair to say Mr. Caldwell had his own interest in seeing your uncle's guardianship dissolved, an interest that predates any concern for your financial welfare. Eleanor felt her spine straighten, felt something cold and clear settle over the nervous flutter that had been sitting in her chest since she took the stand. Mr. Caldwell's interest, sir, was in marrying me honestly, with my uncle's blessing, before my uncle arranged to have him sent away on a fabricated legal summons, specifically to remove that possibility. If you're suggesting Mr. Caldwell somehow orchestrated a 6-year pattern of financial theft that predates our acquaintance by several years, in order to eventually justify a courtship, I'd ask you to explain how a man in his early 20s, living 2 counties away, managed to arrange my mother's death when I was 9, since that's when the guardianship, and apparently the theft, actually began. A ripple of sound moved through the gallery. Not quite laughter, but close to it, and even the judge's mouth twitched faintly before he called the room back to order. Henry's lawyer did not pursue that line of questioning any further. The verdict came on the 9th day, and Eleanor sat gripping Margaret's hand so tightly her knuckles went white as the jury foreman rose to deliver it. Guilty. On every count. Henry Whitfield did not react, did not cry out, did not protest. Simply sat very still in his chair, with his eyes fixed on some point on the floor in front of him, as though some part of him had already accepted this outcome long before the jury ever retired to deliberate. The sentencing came a week later. Restitution to the fullest extent his remaining assets could provide, and 3 years in the state penitentiary a sentence. Judge Hale, presiding over the final proceeding, himself delivered with the flat, unemotional finality of a man who had seen a great many families destroyed by exactly this kind of quiet, patient greed, and had long since stopped finding any satisfaction in handing down the punishment for it. "Mr. Whitfield," Hale said before the bailiff led him away, "you were entrusted with the care of a child who had no one else to protect her interests. You betrayed that trust for 6 years, systematically, and with considerable deliberation, and when the truth threatened to surface, you attempted to marry her off to bury it, rather than face any accounting for your own choices. This court has little sympathy left to extend you." It was only as the bailiff turned Henry toward the side door, toward whatever transport waited to carry him away to serve his sentence, that he finally looked at Eleanor, really looked at her for the first time in the entire proceeding. And something moved across his face that she hadn't expected to see there. Not defiance. Not the cold authority he'd worn like armor for the last 2 decades. Something that looked for just a moment almost like shame. "Eleanor." His voice was rough, unpracticed at anything so plain. "I loved your mother. Whatever else I've done, I want you to know that much was true." Eleanor stood very still, feeling the whole courtroom's attention settle on her, feeling Ethan's steady presence at her shoulder, and her aunt's hand tight in her own, and found when she finally answered that her voice came out quiet and tired and entirely without the fury she'd expected to feel in this exact moment. "Then you should have loved what she left behind, Uncle, instead of spending it." She did not wait to see his reaction. She turned and walked out of that courtroom on Ethan's arm into the gray autumn daylight and did not look back. The weeks after the trial passed differently than Eleanor expected, not with the sudden triumphant relief she'd half imagined during the long months of waiting, but with something slower and more complicated, a gradual settling that came in fits and starts, rather than all at once. There were good days working alongside Margaret and the hired hands Ethan had arranged to help repair the farmhouse roof before winter set in. Fully days when Eleanor caught herself laughing at something small and ordinary, a hen escaping its coop. Margaret's running commentary on the incompetence of the county's carpenters, and realized with a small shock that she had gone whole hours without thinking about courtrooms or trust documents or her uncle's face in that final moment before the bailiff led him away. And there were harder days when the reality of everything that had happened settled over her all at once, unbidden, standing in her mother's kitchen, running her hand along a windowsill her mother might once have touched, and feeling the full weight of everything she'd lost alongside everything she'd finally gained. It was on one of those harder days in early winter that Ethan found her sitting alone on the farmhouse steps, watching the first snow of the season settle over fields that had been only months earlier entirely out of her reach. "You're cold," he said, sitting down beside her without being asked close enough to share warmth. "I'm thinking." "About your uncle. About all of it." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I keep waiting to feel entirely glad about how this ended, and mostly I just feel tired, still the way I told you I felt back in Richmond. Is that strange, to have won and still feel this way?" No, Ethan said simply. I don't think it's strange at all. You didn't just win a lawsuit, Eleanor. You lost the only family you had left, even if he'd already proven himself unworthy of that role years before any of us knew it. Grief doesn't ask permission to sit alongside relief. It just does sometimes, whether we're ready for it or not. Eleanor leaned into his shoulder, and for a long while neither of them spoke, watching the snow settle soft and quiet over land that was for the first time in her adult life entirely her own, to keep or shape however she chose. I want to ask you something, she said finally. Ask. When all of this began, the petition, the trial, everything you told me, you weren't in a hurry, that you'd wait however long it took for me to be ready for whatever came next between us. She turned to look at him, snow catching in her lashes, her voice steady despite the cold. I think I'm ready now, Ethan. I don't want to wait any longer to build something of my own choosing on my own ground with the one person who never once tried to decide it for me. Something shifted in Ethan's face, not surprise, exactly, more like a held breath finally released. Eleanor, ask me properly this time. She said, something almost like a smile breaking through the tiredness in her voice. No leather case, no petition, just you and whatever you actually want to say to me. Ethan reached into his coat, and for one absurd moment, Eleanor half expected another folded legal document. But what he drew out instead was small and plain, and entirely unlike anything that had passed between them in the whole long, complicated course of the last 2 months. A ring. Simple, unadorned, clearly not new, his mother's perhaps, or his grandmother's something, carried a long way and kept close for exactly this moment. Eleanor Whitfield. He said, his voice rough with something he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. I have loved you since before either of us had any right to say so out loud, and I have watched you survive things this past year that would have broken people twice your age and called it merely inconvenient. I don't have a fortune to offer you, and God knows you've had quite enough of men offering you things that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. All I have is this ring, and whatever years are left to me, and a promise that I will never once try to make your decisions for you, only stand beside you while you make them yourself. Will you marry me? Eleanor looked at the ring, and then at him, and felt something in her chest finally fully unclench after months of holding itself braced against one more disappointment, one more betrayal, one more careful calculation of what might still be taken from her. Yes, she said, and the word came out clear and certain in the cold winter air. Yes, Ethan, 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't entirely steady, and Eleanor laughed a real laugh this time, bright and unguarded. The first one in longer than she could properly remember, and kissed him there on the farmhouse steps, with snow settling soft around them both, on land that belonged to her and her alone, built back from the wreckage her uncle had left behind into something that was finally entirely her own to share. The lien notice arrived 4 days after the engagement, carried by the same county rider who'd once brought news of Henry's formal charges, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop the moment she saw the man's face, because some instinct in her had already learned these past months that good news rarely traveled that fast on horseback. Miss Whitfield. He held out a sealed document, apologetic in the particular way of a man delivering trouble he'd had no hand in creating. From the county recorder's office. Thought you'd want it directly given everything. Eleanor broke the seal, standing right there in the yard, Ethan crossing from the barn at the sound of hooves, and read the first few lines twice before the meaning of them fully landed. A lien, she said slowly, against this land, filed by a bank in Petersburg. Ethan reached her side and took the paper, his jaw tightening as he scanned it. Second position behind the trust itself. Whitfield borrowed against this property directly, not the trust land in Fairfax, this specific parcel, your mother's farmhouse, sometime in the last 2 years. Used it as collateral for a personal loan he never disclosed to the examiner. But this is my land. The court awarded it to me. How can a debt he never told anyone about suddenly attach itself to property that's legally mine? Because the loan predates the court's ruling, Ethan said grimly. If he borrowed against it 18 months ago, before any of this came to light, the bank's claim exists independent of the guardianship fraud. They loaned money against what they believed was his to pledge as collateral. Whether he had the right to pledge it is a separate question from whether the debt itself is real. Eleanor felt the ground she'd only just begun to trust beneath her feet start to tilt again. Then they could take the house. They could try. Ethan folded the paper carefully, his voice steady but his eyes hard in a way she recognized now, the particular hardness that meant he was already 3 steps ahead, already calculating. But your uncle had no legal authority to pledge trust property as personal collateral in the first place. That's precisely the kind of self-dealing Judge Hale's ruling was meant to unwind. I'll ride to Richmond in the morning. Ethan? Eleanor caught his sleeve before he could turn toward the barn to see about horses. I am so tired of watching you ride to Richmond to fix what my uncle broke. Something in his face gentled just slightly, even through the tension still sitting in his shoulders. Then come with me this time. They stood together in Judge Hale's chambers 2 days later. The bank's representative, a narrow, unsmiling man named Corwin, who'd traveled up from Petersburg with a folder of his own, seated stiffly across the room, and Eleanor found herself for the first time in this entire long ordeal, speaking not through Ethan or her aunt or anyone else, but directly in her own voice to the man who held her future in his hands one more time. Your Honor, she said, before Corwin's lawyer had even finished laying out his claim. I'd like to understand something plainly if the court will allow it. My uncle borrowed money against land that this same court has already ruled he had no legitimate authority over. Is the bank suggesting that a thief's promise to repay a debt with stolen property somehow binds the person he stole it from? Hale's mouth twitched, the closest thing to amusement Eleanor had seen from him since the day of Henry's sentencing. That is in essence precisely the legal question before me, Miss Whitfield, though I don't imagine Mr. Corwin would phrase it in quite those terms. With respect, Your Honor, Corwin's lawyer said stiffly. My client extended good faith credit against a deed of trust that appeared at the time entirely legitimate. The bank cannot be expected to have anticipated fraud it had no knowledge of. No, Hale agreed. It likely couldn't have. But the bank also cannot expect this court to enforce a lien against property that was never lawfully Henry Whitfield's to pledge in the first place, however innocent the bank's own conduct may have been in extending that credit. Your client's remedy, sir, lies against Mr. Whitfield's remaining personal assets and the restitution proceedings already underway, not against a young woman whose inheritance he attempted to steal not once, but twice. Corwin's shoulders sagged visibly, and his lawyer opened his mouth to object before seeming to think better of it. The lien is void as against the Whitfield property, Hale said, and I'll have the order reflect that clearly enough that no clerk in this state mistakes it for anything else. Mr. Corwin, I'd suggest your bank exercise rather more caution in future about whose collateral it accepts on faith alone. Eleanor felt the breath leave her in a long shaking rush, and beside her Ethan's hand found hers and held it tight. It's over, she whispered. Truly over this time. This time, Ethan agreed quietly. I won't promise you there's nothing else buried somewhere in 6 years of his lies, Eleanor. But I promise you, whatever surfaces, we'll face it the same way we faced this together and in daylight, where lies can't survive very long. They were married in early spring in the small white church 2 miles from the farmhouse, and Eleanor stood at the back of it in a dress her aunt had spent 3 months sewing, feeling a kind of calm she hadn't known herself capable of even 6 months earlier. The church was fuller than she'd expected. She'd braced herself, walking in for empty pews, and averted eyes for the lingering weight of Mrs. Aldridge's careful cruelty in the dry goods store for the particular loneliness of a woman whose name had been dragged through a public trial. Instead, she found the pews filled with faces she recognized, neighbors who'd quietly followed the newspaper coverage of Henry's sentencing and in the months since had watched Eleanor rebuild a neglected farmhouse with her own 2 hands rather than retreat from the county in shame. Harlan Booth was there near the back, having ridden up from Petersburg specifically for the occasion, and when Eleanor caught his eye across the church, he gave her a small, genuine smile, the particular smile of a man who'd once nearly become entangled in her uncle's wreckage, and had found in the aftermath something like friendship instead of resentment. Even Mrs. Aldridge was there, seated stiffly near the middle, and Eleanor felt no need to spare her more than a passing glance. The woman's opinion had cost Eleanor a hard afternoon once. It would not, she'd decided somewhere in the long winter months of rebuilding, cost her a single moment more. Margaret walked her partway down the aisle, there being no father, no uncle fit to stand in that role any longer, and Eleanor had wanted no one else beside her for it, regardless. And at the small gate separating the aisle from the altar, she paused, turning to her aunt with sudden fierce gratitude, threatening to overwhelm the whole careful composure she'd been holding all morning. "Thank you," she said, "for never once making me feel like a burden. For opening your door when everyone else in my life had already closed theirs. You were never a burden, Eleanor." Margaret's eyes were wet, though her voice stayed steady. "You were the daughter I never had arriving exactly when I needed someone to fight for as much as you needed someone fighting for you. Now go on. That man at the altar has been waiting 11 months longer than any decent person ought to have to wait." Eleanor walked the rest of the aisle alone, and Ethan watched her come with an expression that undid every careful thread of composure she'd managed to hold together all morning. Not the calm, controlled look he'd worn stepping out of his carriage all those months ago, but something raw and unguarded and entirely without armor. The look of a man who had ridden 2 days through bad road just to tell her the truth, and had never once stopped choosing her since. "You came," she whispered when she reached him, an old joke between them by now. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he murmured back. "Not this time." The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Eleanor would only half remember afterward. The minister's steady voice, the weight of the ring already familiar on her finger, being joined now by a second plainer band. Ethan's hand warm and sure around hers as they spoke the vows that made official what had in truth been settled between them since a snowy afternoon on the farmhouse steps. It was afterward at the small gathering held in Margaret's garden, under a sky just beginning to soften into evening, that the day's final quiet reckoning arrived. Not a crisis this time, not a lien or a summons, or a desperate rider with bad news, but something smaller and stranger, and in its own way harder to face than any of the courtroom battles that had come before it. A letter. It came by regular post, delivered to the farmhouse 2 weeks earlier, and set aside by Eleanor unopened, because she'd recognized the cramped, careful handwriting on the outside the moment she'd seen it, and had not yet found the courage to read what it contained. She'd carried it folded in her pocket through the entire wedding day, and it was Ethan who noticed her hand drift to it again and again throughout the quiet celebration. "You don't have to read it today," he said gently, finding her alone for a moment, near the roses, the letter once more in her hand, turning it over and over. "I know I don't have to." Eleanor's thumb traced the familiar careful script of her uncle's handwriting. "But I think if I don't do it today, surrounded by everyone who loves me, I'll never find the nerve to do it at all." Ethan didn't argue. He simply stayed beside her, steady and quiet, while she broke the seal and unfolded the single page within. "Eleanor, they tell me I am permitted 1 letter a season, and I have spent longer than I care to admit deciding what deserved to be the first of them. I do not ask forgiveness. I have had a great deal of time these past months to understand precisely how little I deserve it, and I will not insult you by asking for something I know I haven't earned. I write only to say this: your mother would be ashamed of what I did with what she left behind. I knew that 6 years ago, the first time I told myself the withdrawal was temporary, that I would replace it before anyone noticed. I have had a long time now to sit with that shame, and I find it does not diminish with distance the way I once believed guilt would. I heard through channels I won't trouble you with that you married Mr. Caldwell. I am glad of it, whatever that gladness is worth from a man in my position. He fought harder for your welfare in a few weeks than I managed to protect in 6 years, and I think, if I am honest with myself, for perhaps the first time in a very long while, that you are considerably better off for his presence in your life than you would ever have been under my continued guardianship, however well-intentioned I once told myself it was. I do not expect you to write back. I do not expect anything from you at all, ever again, and that is precisely as it should be. Henry." Eleanor read it twice, standing very still among the roses, And when she finally lowered the page, her eyes were wet, but her voice when it came was steadier than she expected. "He's sorry," she said half to herself. "Or he says he is. I don't know that I entirely believe him even now." "Does it matter?" Ethan asked quietly. "Whether you believe him." Eleanor considered that for a long moment, turning the letter over once more in her hands, feeling the particular weight of 6 years of careful lies compressed now into a single page of belated uncertain regret. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it does. Not anymore. I spent so long believing his version of things that I had nothing of my own, that I owed him gratitude for scraps of a life that should have been fully mine. I think I'm done spending my belief on him at all, whether he's telling the truth in this letter or simply managing his own guilt from a cell in Richmond. I have my own life to build now. I don't have room left over to carry his." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Not thrown away. Not answered. Simply set aside the way a person sets aside a wound that's finally begun slowly to close. "Come on," she said, taking Ethan's hand and turning back toward the gathering, toward Margaret's laughter, carrying across the garden, and Harlan Booth's voice, raised in some story or other, toward the whole warm, imperfect, hard-won life, waiting for her on the other side of that rose hedge. "There's a wedding happening. I believe it's mine." They rode out to the farmhouse together, as the sun dropped low over the fields, the last of the wedding guests' laughter fading behind them, and Eleanor felt for the first time in longer than she could properly measure a stillness settle over her that had nothing to do with exhaustion, and everything to do with simply finally arriving somewhere she was meant to be. The house stood waiting for them, windows lit gold from the lamps Margaret had insisted on lighting before they left the church, and Eleanor paused at the gate, looking at it, really looking, the way she hadn't quite let herself look at anything in months, too busy fighting one battle or another to simply stand still and see what she'd actually built. "A year ago," she said slowly, "I was kneeling in my aunt's garden with dirt under my fingernails, believing myself abandoned by everyone who might have fought for me. I didn't know I had an inheritance. I didn't know my uncle was a thief. I didn't know you'd spent 7 months in Charleston writing letters you never sent, because you thought silence would protect me better than the truth would." "A great deal has changed," Ethan agreed quietly, standing beside her at the gate. "Everything has changed." Eleanor turned to look at him fully. The lamplight from the house catching the ring on her hand, the plain gold band that had replaced every uncertain borrowed version of her future, she'd once been handed by men who thought they knew better than she did what she deserved. "I have a home that's mine because a court said so, and because I fought for it, and because you rode 2 days through bad weather to make sure I had the chance to fight it all. I have an aunt who never once made me feel like a burden, and a husband who never once tried to decide my life for me, instead of standing beside me while I decided it myself, and a rather large repair bill on that roof," Ethan added, with the ghost of a smile, "which I intend to help you settle since apparently I'm now legally obligated to." Eleanor laughed a real laugh, unguarded and bright. The same laugh that had first cracked open somewhere on the farmhouse steps in the snow and pulled him toward the gate, toward the lit windows and the waiting rooms, and the whole long, unwritten stretch of years ahead of them. "I used to think," she said, pausing at the door, her hand resting flat against the worn wood her mother had once touched, "that a woman's worth was measured by who chose to keep her. My uncle taught me that whether he meant to or not, that I was something to be managed, married off, quietly disposed of when I became inconvenient to his plans. I believed it for 6 years, Ethan. I believed it long after I should have known better. And now," Eleanor pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold into the warm lamplight of the home she had rebuilt with her own hands, the home no court, no uncle, no desperate arrangement could ever again take from her. "Now I know the truth," she said, turning back to him with the whole of that hard-won certainty written plain across her face. A woman's worth was never something to be given by anyone else at all. It was mine the entire time, whether anyone chose to see it or not, and no one, not my uncle, not a bank in Petersburg, not every gossiping tongue in 3 counties, is ever going to convince me otherwise again. Ethan followed her over the threshold and pulled the door closed behind them, both shutting out the last of the evening and everything that had once threatened to take this life away from her before she'd ever had the chance to claim it fully as her own. And somewhere behind them in a Richmond cell, Henry Whitfield sat alone with the knowledge that he had lost the one thing money and lies could never buy back, while ahead of Eleanor Whitfield in the golden lamplight of her mother's house stood the whole of a life, finally fully unshakably her own.